The panel president's gavel hadn't fallen yet, but Captain Vanessa Cole was already on her feet, and every head in the courtroom had turned toward her. 11 weeks earlier, she had signed the arrest warrant herself. She had stood in front of a room of officers and laid out evidence so clean, so complete, that not one person in that building had thought to ask a second question. Badge swipes, a storage unit, a witness who saw exactly what the case needed him to see. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes was guilty. Vanessa had been certain of it. Now she was standing again, in the same uniform, about to tell that same room she had been wrong. Not wrong about a detail. Not wrong about a technicality a defense attorney could exploit for reasonable doubt. Wrong about the man himself. A wrongness that had a wife in the gallery, and a 2-year-old daughter, and 11 weeks that could never be given back no matter what happened in the next 10 minutes. Her commanding officer had ordered her to let it go. "The case is closed," he'd told her. "Don't reopen it on a feeling." She had saluted, said, "Understood, sir," and gone home and done exactly what she'd been told not to do, because a timestamp on a security log didn't sit right, and because some part of her had never quite believed a case could come together that easily, without someone shaping it to look that way. She hadn't told her command what she'd found. Not yet. Not until she was sure. Because being sure a second time, after being sure the first time had already cost a man his freedom, meant something different now. The trial counsel turned to her. "Captain Cole, you asked to testify. Go ahead." Vanessa took a breath and told the truth she'd been building toward for 11 weeks. The warehouse lights buzzed overhead, throwing long shadows across rows of shipping containers stenciled with serial numbers. Captain Vanessa Cole stood in the doorway of Bay 14, watching 2 evidence technicians photograph an empty rack where 3 crates of thermal targeting systems should have been sitting. "Talk to me," she said. Sergeant Priya Anand looked up from her clipboard. "Inventory log says the crates were signed out for a routine calibration transfer 6 days ago. Problem is, there's no calibration facility on the receiving end. The transfer order routes to a storage bay that doesn't officially exist." Vanessa crouched by the empty rack, running her flashlight along the dust outline where the crates had sat. Someone had been careful. Someone had not been careful enough. "Who signed the transfer order?" Anand flipped a page. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes, Logistics NCO, assigned here 11 months. Vanessa had been with CID for 9 years, long enough to know that most cases didn't announce themselves this cleanly. She didn't trust clean. But she also didn't ignore evidence because it made her nervous, and right now the evidence was stacking up in one direction with the kind of consistency that usually meant guilt, not coincidence. Over the next 4 days, that consistency held. Reyes's access badge had swiped into Bay 14 twice after normal duty hours, both times without a corresponding work order. A storage unit in his name, 20 minutes off base, had been rented in cash 3 weeks before the theft, and a junior specialist named Corporal Tate came forward, quietly, almost reluctantly, and told Vanessa he'd seen Reyes loading crates into a personal vehicle near the depot after dark. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," Tate said, sitting across from her in the interview room, hands wrapped around a coffee he wasn't drinking. "Guys move gear around all hours, but when I heard what went missing, I couldn't just sit on it." Vanessa wrote it down. It matched everything else. It matched too well. Some small voice in the back of her mind whispered, and she set that voice aside the way she'd trained herself to. Instinct wasn't evidence. Evidence was evidence. Her partner on the case, Chief Warrant Officer Ray Ostrowski, leaned against the doorframe of her office 2 days later, arms crossed, watching her build the final report. "You're wrapping this fast," he said. "The case is solid." "It's solid," he agreed. "It's also convenient. Badge swipes, a storage unit, a witness who just happens to remember something a week later. Feels like somebody handed it to you." Vanessa didn't look up from her screen. "You want me to ignore a case because it came together well. I want you to ask why it came together this well." "I did ask. Every lead corroborates the last one. That's not convenient, Ray. That's an investigation working the way it's supposed to." She said it with more edge than she meant to, and Ostrowski held up both hands and let it go. She understood his instinct. She even respected it. But 9 years in CID had taught her that overthinking a straightforward case was its own kind of failure. The kind that let guilty men walk while investigators chased shadows looking for a twist that wasn't there. Reyes had motive. The storage unit lease showed he was 3 months behind on payments, according to a records pull she'd requested from a civilian financial database. He had access. He had opportunity. He had a witness who placed him at the scene. She signed the arrest warrant herself. They picked him up on a Tuesday morning outside the motor pool in front of his unit. Reyes was a broad-shouldered man in his late 20s with a wife and a 2-year-old daughter, and when Vanessa read him his rights, he didn't fight, didn't raise his voice. He just stared at her with an expression she'd seen before from guilty men and, less often, from innocent ones. And the two never looked quite the same to her, except that this time, for half a second, she wasn't entirely sure which one she was looking at. "I didn't do this," he said quietly, as the MPs guided him toward the vehicle. "Whatever you found, I didn't do this." "You'll have the chance to make that case," Vanessa told him, because it was true, and because it was the only thing she was permitted to say. She watched the vehicle pull away, and told herself the tightness in her chest was nothing more than the ordinary weight of putting a man's future into motion. She had built cases like this before. She would build them again. The evidence had led somewhere, and she had followed it, and that was the job. That night, alone in her office with the case file open on her desk, she found herself scrolling back through the timeline one more time. Not because anything was wrong, she told herself, but because that was simply what a careful investigator did before closing a file for good. Everything lined up. Every date, every signature, every swipe of a badge. Almost everything. She closed the laptop before the thought could finish forming and told herself it would keep until morning. 6 weeks later, with the court-martial date set for the following month, Vanessa sat in her office preparing her testimony. Trial counsel wanted her to walk through the evidence chain in order. First the missing inventory, then the badge swipes, then the storage unit, then Tate's statement, clean and linear, the way she'd present it to a panel of officers who had no patience for complexity. She pulled up the badge access logs one more time to confirm the exact timestamps she'd cite on the stand. March 14th, 21:47 hours. March 19th, 22:31 hours. Both after normal duty hours. Both without a corresponding work order, exactly as she remembered. Except the system log showed something she hadn't noticed the first time through, a third badge swipe. March 14th, 2038 hours, over an hour before Reyes's entry. A different badge number. She checked it against her master list. It belonged to Major Ellis Whitfield, the logistics officer who'd signed off on the original theft report and requested CID's involvement in the first place. Vanessa sat with that for a long moment. It wasn't damning. Officers came and went from secure bays all the time, and Whitfield had every legitimate reason to be in Bay 14. It was his depot. But she hadn't logged his access in her original timeline. She hadn't asked why he was there over an hour before the man she'd later arrest on the same night the crates disappeared. It was a small thing. The kind of detail a defense attorney might raise, and a prosecutor would wave away in 10 seconds. Vanessa had built stronger cases on thinner ice, but it sat wrong in her stomach the way Ostrowski's warning had sat wrong in her stomach 6 weeks earlier, and this time she didn't set it aside. She brought it to Lieutenant Colonel Marsh the next morning, framing it carefully, the way she'd learned to frame anything that might sound like doubt. "It's probably nothing," she said, standing in his office doorway rather than sitting, as if that made the conversation shorter. "But I found an access log entry I hadn't accounted for. I'd like a few days to confirm it doesn't change anything before trial." Marsh didn't look up from the papers on his desk right away. When he did, his expression was the particular kind of patient that Vanessa had come to recognize as its own quiet warning. "Captain," The trial is in 4 weeks. The command is under pressure to show this office can handle classified equipment losses without it becoming a public relations problem. You built a clean case. Reyes had motive, access, a witness. A stray badge swipe from an officer who works in that building isn't a hole, it's noise. I'd still like to run it down. Run it down informally, off the clock, if it'll let you sleep. Marsh's tone softened slightly, and Vanessa understood he wasn't trying to be cruel. He was trying to close a file that had already cost the command enough embarrassment. But I don't want this reopened on the record. Not 4 weeks out, not on a timestamp. Understood, sir. She left his office with the same feeling she'd had closing her laptop 6 weeks earlier. The sense of a door being held shut by her own hand, and the growing suspicion that something on the other side of it wanted out. That evening, she sat in her car in the parking lot long after her shift ended. Engine off, case file printed and spread across the passenger seat, because she didn't trust herself to leave a digital trail of second-guessing while the order stood to leave it alone. She thought about Reyes's face when they arrested him. I didn't do this. She'd heard that line from guilty men 100 times. She'd also heard it, twice in 9 years, from men who turned out to be telling the truth. And both times the case against them had looked exactly as clean as this one did. She thought about her record. 9 years without a case that fell apart at trial. A reputation, hard-earned, for being the investigator who didn't cut corners and didn't chase ghosts either. Reopening this, even quietly, risked both halves of that reputation at once. If she was wrong, she'd look like an officer who couldn't leave a solved case alone. If she was right, she'd have to explain why she'd missed it the first time, in front of people who were already looking for a reason to question her judgment. And if she did nothing, and she was right, a man with a 2-year-old daughter would spend years in a military prison for a crime someone else had committed. She picked up her phone and called Priya Anand. I need a favor, Vanessa said when Anand picked up. Off the books. And I need you to understand before I ask that if this goes nowhere, I want it to have never happened. There was a pause on the line. The sound of Anand setting something down. This about Reyes? It's about a timestamp that doesn't belong where it is. Another pause, longer this time. Marsh know you're calling me? Marsh told me to run it down informally. I'm running it down informally. Anand exhaled, and Vanessa could hear the decision being made on the other end of the line. The same calculation Vanessa had just finished making herself, weighing a career against a question that wouldn't go away on its own. Send me what you've got, Anand said finally. I'll take a look tonight. Vanessa looked down at the case file spread across her passenger seat, the file she had built, signed, and closed with her own name, and started the engine. Anand called back 2 nights later, her voice low, the kind of low that meant she wasn't alone in whatever room she was calling from. The storage unit lease, she said. You pulled the physical copy or just the scan? Scan. The facility manager emailed it over during the initial investigation. Get the physical original. I compared the signature on your scan against Reyes's signature on his enlistment paperwork and 2 other military documents. It's close. It's close enough that nobody would flag it in a quick review. But the pressure points are wrong. Where he lifts the pen, where he loops the R. I've seen enough forged documents to know close isn't the same as real. Vanessa sat up straighter at her kitchen table, the case file spread in front of her like it had been every night that week. You're telling me someone forged Reyes's signature on the lease. I'm telling you I wouldn't testify to it without the original in hand. But yes, that's what it looks like to me. It took Vanessa 3 days to get the physical lease from the storage facility, driving out personally rather than requesting it through channels that might reach back to Marsh's office. The manager, a heavy-set man named Costa, who ran the place out of a converted trailer, barely remembered the transaction. Guy paid cash for 3 months up front, Costa said, flipping through a filing cabinet that looked like it hadn't been organized since the Clinton administration. I don't ask a lot of questions when somebody pays cash. Do you remember what he looked like? Costa squinted, thinking. Average build. Didn't stick around to chat. Honestly, ma'am, I get a lot of guys renting units out here. They start to blur. It wasn't the answer Vanessa wanted, But it wasn't nothing either. Reyes was not, by any description, an average-build man. He stood well over 6 feet, built like the wrestler he'd been in high school according to his personnel file. A description that generic didn't rule him out, but it didn't confirm him either, and 6 weeks ago, working backward from an assumption of guilt, she hadn't asked. She brought the original lease to Anand, who photographed the signature under raking light, and sent both images to a friend at a civilian forensic lab, off the record, framed as a personal favor rather than an official request. The answer came back 3 days later. Inconsistent pen pressure, inconsistent letter formation, high probability of forgery. That alone might have been explainable. One bad piece of evidence in an otherwise sound case. But it was the second thread, and 2 threads made a pattern Vanessa could no longer talk herself out of seeing. She went back to Corporal Tate. This time she didn't ask him to confirm what he'd already told her. She asked him to walk her through the night itself, minute by minute, without referencing his original statement. "You said you saw Reyes loading crates into a personal vehicle," Vanessa said. "What kind of vehicle?" Tate hesitated. "A truck, dark-colored. Reyes drives a blue Silverado." "Was it a Silverado?" I think so. It was dark out. In your original statement, you said you recognized him clearly enough to identify him by face. Was it dark, or could you see his face?" Tate's eyes moved to the door, then back to her, and Vanessa recognized the particular stillness of a man calculating how much backing out would cost him. "Ma'am, I told CID what I saw." "I'm asking what you actually saw, Corporal, not what ended up in the report." The silence stretched long enough that Vanessa almost let it go, almost decided she'd pushed a scared junior soldier past the point of usefulness. Then Tate said quietly, "Someone came to me after the equipment went missing. Told me they already knew it was Reyes, that the investigation just needed someone to confirm the timeline. Said it would look better for me if I remembered seeing something instead of getting dragged in as a person of interest myself, since I'd worked that shift too." "Who told you that?" Tate shook his head. "I don't know his name. Older guy, officer, I think. I didn't ask. I just wanted it to be over." It wasn't a name. It wasn't enough to take anywhere yet. But it confirmed what the forged signature had already suggested. Someone with knowledge of the investigation, someone with rank enough to approach a corporal and shape his testimony, had built the case against Reyes as carefully as Vanessa had built her arrest. She spent the next 4 nights with Anand going through shipment and inventory records for every depot Whitfield had sign-off authority over, not just Bay 14. On the 5th night, at nearly midnight, Anand found it. A second discrepancy at a smaller depot 11 miles away. Equipment listed as transferred for repair 8 months earlier that had never arrived at its stated destination and had never been chased down because no one had ever reported it missing in the first place. The paperwork showed it as resolved. It wasn't. 2 depots, Anand said, staring at the screen. Same signing authority on both. Nobody connects them because nobody was looking for a connection. This isn't one theft, Vanessa. This is a pattern somebody's been running for a while, and Reyes just happened to be standing in the right place when they needed a name to put on it. Vanessa looked at the timeline they'd rebuilt across 3 whiteboards in Anand's spare room. Badge swipes, forged signatures, a coached witness, a second unreported loss traced back to the same signing authority. It no longer looked like a case with one loose thread. It looked like a structure built by someone who understood exactly how CID investigations worked, understood what evidence would satisfy an investigator moving quickly under command pressure, and had used that understanding to hand her a suspect gift-wrapped. "If I'm right about who's behind this," Vanessa said slowly, "it's not a logistics sergeant with a gambling problem. It's somebody with enough rank and access to move equipment across 2 depots and coach a witness without anyone asking questions." Anand didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had lost its earlier steadiness. "Then you're not just about to embarrass Marsh for closing a case too fast. You're about to accuse an officer, maybe more than one, of running this. And you're doing it 4 weeks before you're scheduled to put an innocent man's conviction on the record with your own testimony. Vanessa looked at Whitfield's name, circled twice on the whiteboard, and felt the ground she'd been standing on for 9 years shift slightly beneath her. Then I have 4 weeks to be sure, she said. The civilian contractor's name was Gary Purnell, and Vanessa found him the way she found most things in a conspiracy that had otherwise covered its tracks well, through a mistake someone hadn't bothered to hide, because they hadn't expected anyone to look this closely. Purnell held a maintenance contract for calibration equipment across 3 depots, including Bay 14 and the smaller facility 11 miles out. His company's vehicle logs, obtained through a public procurement database rather than anything that would flag back to CID, showed his truck on base the same week both thefts occurred. More than that, his signature appeared as a countersigning witness on the transfer paperwork for the unreported loss at the second depot, the one nobody had ever investigated because nobody had ever reported it missing. He's got legitimate reasons to be on base, Annan cautioned, laying the vehicle logs beside the transfer paperwork. This isn't proof. It's a reason to ask him hard questions. Whitfield has legitimate reasons to sign transfer orders. Purnell has legitimate reasons to be on base. Reyes had legitimate reasons to be in that storage unit's neighborhood, if we're being honest, because half the junior enlisted rent unit's out that way. Legitimate reasons are how you hide something in plain sight. Vanessa stood back from the whiteboard, arms crossed, looking at the 2 names circled together. Whitfield has sign-off authority and access. Purnell has a legitimate cover for moving equipment off base and existing buyers for it through his company's supplier network. That's not a coincidence. That's a partnership. She took what she had to Marsh 2 days later, laying it out with more evidence than she'd walked in with the first time. The forged signature, Tate's coach testimony, the second unreported loss, Purnell's paperwork trail. She expected pushback. She hadn't expected the particular coldness in Marsh's face as he listened. "You went outside this office," he said when she finished. "You had a civilian lab analyze evidence without authorization. You re-interviewed a witness without informing trial counsel. You're accusing a major of orchestrating equipment theft 4 weeks before his own subordinate's case goes to trial, based on an unofficial forensic opinion and a corporal who's already changed his story once. Sir, I understand how this looks. I don't think you do, Captain. I think you're so convinced you missed something the first time that you've built a second case out of your own guilt, and you're asking me to blow up a solved prosecution on the strength of it." Marsh's voice didn't rise, which somehow made it worse. "The order stands. This case is closed. You will testify to the evidence chain as originally documented, and you will not discuss this so-called second investigation with anyone else in this command. Is that understood?" It was, Vanessa realized, the sound of a man protecting something. Whether it was the command's reputation, his own judgment in trusting her original case, or something closer to Whitfield than she wanted to consider, she couldn't yet tell. But it wasn't the sound of a commanding officer weighing evidence on its merits. "Understood, sir," she said, because there was nothing else to say in that room, and left before her face could show him anything more. 3 nights later, she went to retrieve the physical storage lease and the forensic comparison photos from the evidence locker where she'd secured them separately from the official case file. A small precaution she'd taken almost without thinking, the instinct of an investigator who'd spent a career watching evidence go missing in cases that mattered to someone with rank. The lease was gone. The forensic photos were gone. The sign-out log showed no record of anyone accessing that section of the locker in the past 2 weeks, which was, in its own way, more disturbing than if it had shown Marsh's name or Whitfield's. It meant whoever had taken it had access that didn't require signing anything at all. Vanessa stood in the evidence room for a long time, the fluorescent lights humming overhead the same way they had in Bay 14 the morning this whole thing started, and let herself feel, fully, what she'd been holding at arm's length for weeks. She was no longer chasing a loose thread. Someone with real power inside this command had just confirmed, by trying to erase it, that her evidence was close enough to the truth to be dangerous. She thought about Marsh's order. She thought about her record, 9 years of it, about to be either vindicated or destroyed depending on what she did in the next 4 weeks. She thought about Reyes's daughter, who would be old enough to ask questions about her father by the time any appeal worked its way through the system, if it ever did. And she thought about the version of herself that had signed that arrest warrant with total confidence, certain that clean evidence meant a clean truth, and how much easier it would be to let that version of herself stay right. She had copies. Digital scans she'd made for her own working file, stored on a drive that lived in her personal safe rather than anywhere connected to the base network. Another small precaution, taken without quite admitting to herself why she thought she'd need it. It wasn't everything. The forensic lab could rerun the analysis on new samples if it came to that, and Tate, scared as he was, had said what he'd said out loud, to her, and could say it again under oath if someone gave him the chance. Marsh had ordered her to stand down. Going around that order meant risking her commission, her 9 years, everything she'd built a reputation on. But standing down meant watching an innocent man get convicted with her own testimony as the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, while the people who'd framed him walked back into their offices the next morning. Vanessa closed the empty evidence locker and drove to trial counsel's office before she could talk herself out of it. The courtroom smelled like old carpet and coffee gone cold in paper cups. Vanessa sat in the gallery for the first 2 days of testimony, watching trial counsel, a young captain named Osei, who'd listened to her for 3 hours the night she came to him, and who had spent the 2 days since verifying what he could before agreeing to let her speak again, lay the groundwork for what was about to happen. Reyes sat at the defense table in his dress uniform, shoulders squared, the same careful stillness Vanessa had seen in him the morning of his arrest. His wife sat 2 rows behind him, a folder of unopened mail in her lap like she hadn't had the composure to deal with ordinary life in weeks. Vanessa hadn't spoken to either of them since the arrest. She wasn't sure what she'd say if she did. When the prosecution moved to rest its case, Osei stood. "Your Honor, the government requests to recall a witness for supplemental testimony directly relevant to the evidentiary chain already presented." The panel president's eyebrows rose slightly. Marsh, seated near the back of the courtroom, went very still. Vanessa walked to the stand and was sworn in a second time. Her hands didn't shake, which surprised her. She had expected them to. "Captain Cole," Osei said, "you were the lead investigator on the original case against Staff Sergeant Reyes. I'd like you to tell the panel what you found after the investigation was closed." She had rehearsed this in her head every night for a week, and still, standing there, the words felt heavier coming out than they had sitting alone at her kitchen table. "I built the original case in good faith, based on evidence that was consistent and, at the time, convincing," she said. "Badge access logs, a storage unit leased in the defendant's name, and a witness statement placing him at the scene. I want to be clear with this panel that I do not believe that evidence was insufficient because I was careless. I believe it was insufficient because it was constructed to be convincing by someone who understood exactly what an investigator would need to see." She laid it out in order, the way she'd laid it out for Marsh weeks earlier, except this time no one told her to stop. The badge swipe belonging to Major Whitfield, logged over an hour before Reyes's own entry and never accounted for in her original timeline. The forensic inconsistency in the storage unit lease signature. Corporal Tate's account of being approached and coached before giving his original statement. Tate himself would testify to that directly an hour later, visibly frightened but steady, in a way that told Vanessa he'd finally decided being honest mattered more than being comfortable. The second, unreported equipment loss at a depot 11 miles away, signed off by the same authority. The maintenance contractor whose company vehicle logs placed him on base during both incidents, and whose signature appeared on paperwork tied to the loss nobody had ever flagged. "I want the panel to understand something," Vanessa said near the end. "I was ordered to consider this matter closed. I chose not to, because the alternative was letting a man I had reason to believe was innocent be convicted on evidence I had reason to believe was manufactured. I'm not asking anyone in this room to take my judgment on faith a second time. I'm asking the panel to look at the evidence itself." The defense's cross-examination was sharp, as she'd expected. Pointed questions about her unauthorized investigation, her disregard of a direct order, whether her own guilt over the initial arrest had colored everything she'd found afterward. She answered each one without flinching, because she'd already asked herself the same questions in the dark more than once, and she'd stopped being afraid of the answers. It took 11 more days for the formal investigation into Whitfield and Purnell to produce enough corroborating evidence. Bank records, a second forensic analysis conducted properly through official channels this time, and testimony from a warehouse worker at the second depot who'd been quietly paid to look the other way, for charges to be filed against both men. Reyes was acquitted before any of that finished, the panel unwilling to convict on evidence Vanessa herself had dismantled in open court. She saw him once more, in the parking lot outside the courthouse, his wife waiting by their car with their daughter on her hip. Reyes stopped when he saw her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I believe the evidence," Vanessa said finally. "I should have believed it less." Reyes studied her for a long moment. "You could have let it go. Everybody told you to." "I know. That doesn't fix the 11 weeks. "No," Vanessa said. "It doesn't." He nodded once, not quite forgiveness, not quite anything else, and walked to his car. Vanessa watched him go, then drove back to an office where her reputation would take months to fully repair, if it ever entirely did, where some people would remember her as the investigator who got it wrong, and others as the one who was honest enough to admit it in front of everyone who mattered. She thought that was probably the most any investigator could ask of the job, not to be right the first time, but to keep looking hard enough and long enough to be right before it was too late to matter. And that's where Captain Vanessa Cole's story ends. A reminder that real integrity isn't about never being wrong, but about having the courage to correct it, no matter the cost. If this story moved you, give it a like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and we'll see you in the next video.